Hello, my name is Jasmine Johnson. I am a licensed clinical therapist, owner and lead therapist for Blue Pearl Therapy LLC, and also an affiliate of Pineapple Support. Today I will be speaking to you about mental health and sex work, specifically the stigma that surrounds mental health and sex work. I'm going to be reading from a couple of notes from a workshop that's provided by Pineapple Support and Blue Pearl Therapy, and I encourage you all to either consider getting in contact with Pineapple Support or Blue Pearl Therapy or your local mental health support organization if you're struggling through any of the content today. I'm going to be providing you some practical tips on how you can avoid some of the mental health outcomes that are related to stigma as a worker in the sex industry. And I'll also be providing some tips for those of you who engage often with sex work and sex content on whether it's the internet or in person in those states where that type of sex work is legal. So for the context of today's training, I think it's incredibly important that we specify we are talking about legal sex work, we're talking about voluntary sex work, we're talking about sex workers that are empowered to do the type of work that they do. So now that that's in context, let's go ahead and define what sex work is. So sex work is the exchange of sexual services, performances, or product for material compensation. It includes activities from direct physical contact between buyer and sellers, as well as indirect sexual stimulation. So that can be everyone from our escorts in the industry to our cam girls. And I also want to do a little bit of extra of a disclaimer here. Not only am I a clinical therapist and support a great number of sex workers through their mental health needs, but I am also engaged in the sex industry as well. So today's training will be coming from both a professional standpoint and some personal experience as well. I'd also like to take a moment to define stigma. What is stigma? Well, let's find out. It's a mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or person. Other synonyms include shame, disgrace, dishonor, blot, or blemish. So when we think about stigma, it definitely is a negative connotation that is attached to sex work and how that has an impact on sex workers and their mental health. And that's what we'll be focusing on today. There's lots of different types of stigma. Some of us experience stigma from a bit of a distance where others don't know the type of work that we do. And we kind of hang in the shadows knowing that people may feel a certain way about the type of work and may look down upon us. That's a certain pressure that a lot of sex workers carry, especially when they haven't shared openly the kind of work that they do. Others have covering stigma, where they may only share a fraction of what they do or to only a fraction of the people that they know what they do. So it is a quite isolating aspect of stigma. And finally, there's anticipatory stigma. And those are, that type of stigma is where folks in the sex industry may use quite a lot of caution. Maybe they'll share with a close best friend the type of work that they do, but they would never share it openly at, let's say, a bank or to other parents where their children go to school. Places where you may have a casual conversation about the type of work that you do. Those that are affected by anticipatory stigma will rarely take a chance at sharing and risking being outed. Let's talk about some of the identifying impact. I have several listed here under personally and professionally. Well, personally, it's pretty clear that if you're practicing sex work and there is a lot of stigma associated with it, which we know culturally there is, that you're going to experience some negative impacts. Some of those are not being able to celebrate one's decision towards self-determination. Here we are in this industry, enjoying it, making a great lifestyle and livelihood off of it, but not being able to celebrate or share how one has been empowered to make this decision to be in an industry that they may find fulfilling. It can become incredibly isolating if we're unable to share the type of work that we do, the type of engagement and encounters that we have on a day-to-day basis in our work. We could spend a lot of time avoiding friends and family, or engaging in different activities that may call for us to talk about our day-to-day lives. And this avoidance can lead to more isolation. And we certainly know that isolation, feelings of not being accepted, lead to things like depression and anxiety and other stressors, both mentally, emotionally, and physically. When you are operating from a place of stigma, there is the chance that you're only bringing a fraction of yourself into almost any aspect of your day-to-day life. So let's think about that. Sex work, for the most part, may not be appropriate to talk about to lots of people in your life on a pretty open, from a pretty open space, just because of things like age-appropriate conversations, audience-appropriate conversations. So when we're interacting in a lot of different spaces, we often are double thinking about, is it appropriate for me to talk about my day-to-day life experiences? And if not, you may be presenting just a fraction of yourself, even in places and spaces where it's incredibly important to be forthcoming. Those places and spaces include sex workers often, more often than not, are not sharing with their medical providers the type of work that they do for fear of being judged. Not sharing the type of work that you do can have an incredible impact on recommendations for medicine, for medical care and treatment, as well as lifestyle recommendations. This also goes for a lot of sex workers that are seeking mental health support. Oftentimes, they will deal with certain work-related stressors that they're unable to discuss with their therapist because of fear of stigma and shame, being shamed for the type of work that they do, or being constantly asked to leave the industry, which again, we're talking about those that are voluntary, happily engaged in the industry and are empowered by the choice that they made, however, are constantly coming to a head with others who don't feel like this is a good decision based on their own personal judgment of the sex industry. Sex workers may face discrimination by service providers and find it difficult to obtain resources. I work with many clients who don't feel comfortable sharing why they may need particular resources, or going out and requesting particular resources when they know that their job title or their earnings is going to become in question, and that's going to cause the need for them to disclose, and for fear of judgment and shame, again, avoidance, and also avoiding resources that may be available to them. If you are working in the shadows, so to speak, of sex work, and you're closeted and not feeling open to sharing, it's okay for now. That is a temporary situation that is important for you to safeguard and protect your livelihood. But I certainly want to open up the opportunities for giving you options to share when it is absolutely necessary that you share. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, because having options help us very much so cope with the stigma that's related to being in sex work. You have the choice of getting involved openly or boldly or quietly. These options of how we address stigma are incredibly important too. So just want you to know that however you decide to confront stigma, it is valid and it is okay. The most important part is if we can identify how stigma has an impact on us, then we can fix it and or adjust to it in the most healthiest of ways. Also want to share that professionally, a lot of sex workers feel somewhat trapped in their industry because of the stigma that's attached to it. Sex workers find it very difficult to leave the sex industry and jump into a quote unquote regular job. So just the term regular automatically creates a distinction between work that has stigma and work that doesn't. And so for the context of today's training, we don't want to make sex work seem as though it is not normal or regular. So I will just say sex workers can find it very difficult to switch into other industries because of the stigma that's attached to the work that they have been doing. Oftentimes there's a lot of concern of moral character that comes up from potential employers. And, it's kind of that silly, really stupid saying that if you are a sex worker or if you have engaged in any form of sexual freedom, that you're not qualified for certain work. We couldn't find that to be further away from the truth, as we know sex workers engage in a lot of skill sets that are transferable to many different industries, from IT, customer service, marketing, and sales. Sex workers do a great deal of it and have transferable skills. However, stigma is what keeps others in society from seeing that as viable skill sets to other industries, making it very difficult for sex workers to diversify themselves outside of the sex industry. And also professionally, one of the things that come along with stigma and has a direct effect on the wear and tear, so to speak, of the sex worker is high burnout. These high stressors that we're speaking about, the lack of support, social support and professional support and resources can certainly lead to high burnout. So now that we know all of the things that may be having an impact personally and professionally because of stigma as it relates to the sex industry, let's talk about some coping mechanisms. Now that we know what's out there, let's figure out how to live and deal with it. The first thing is, I think I better couch that these are not based on what it should be like, because technically we should be able to work in any legal industry and not face stigma. However, these recommendations are going to be based on currently what it's like in reality to be a sex worker and have to find ways to cope with the stigma that's attached to it and maintain and also develop very healthy coping strategies and mechanisms. All right, so here it goes. Number one, diversify your earnings. This will help reduce the fear of being trapped. Sex workers feel safer dealing with stigma-related issues when they have a backup plan. So this doesn't necessarily mean you have to leave the industry, but finding ways to diversify your earnings from the industry. Lots of sex workers have found it to be very, very comforting knowing that they're saving for their retirement, that they are purchasing real estate, stocks, and other business ventures, even business ventures within the industry, to make certain that they are secure in the longevity of this industry, as well as having certain number of streams of income to be able to feel comfortable in sustaining their lifestyle. Look for promotional opportunities within the industry. You can't age out of a good producer, writer, editor, agent, and consultant. So if you are in front of the screen, look for opportunities behind the screen as well. Again, creating longevity in the industry that you're in. And if you should want to get from in front of the camera, you are prepared to do so. So continuing to build those skill sets, and that way it doesn't make the sex industry as employment seem small and daunting, especially at the thought of having trouble transitioning out of it or into other areas. There's lots going on in the sex industry, everything from IT, apps, all kinds of financial development opportunities. And so I strongly suggest that those that, especially that are new to the industry, really think of their longevity and sustainability, given that stigma can make us feel trapped. Find a trusted mental health support. Companies like Pineapplesummit that will help connect you to sex worker friendly therapists is fantastic for recommendations and supplemental support. Companies like Blue Pearl Therapy that know the industry from the inside out and provide support to sex workers dealing with things that are well beyond sex work. So anything from depression, anxiety, trauma to decision making. Mental health support is truly a part of your medical care. So I strongly suggest having mental health support, a therapist, a counselor, support groups, trainings and workshops just like this as a viable part of being able to sustain in the industry where stigma is high and burnout is also. Find a trusted medical provider. Interview them the same way you would for any other service. Go in, get recommendations, meet and sit with the provider, tell them about your work in the sex industry, call anonymously, and hear what the reaction is if you need to. It is incredibly important that you take time to find medical help and mental health providers that are willing to work with you despite what industry or lifestyle you engage in. You really want someone that embodies the same attitudes, or at least are open to your attitudes, views, and lifestyle. Staying away from avoidance coping. While temporarily it may be the thing that you need to do, taking a step back, making sure that it's safe for you to disclose. It's important that once you find someone that you disclose, that you feel comfortable disclosing the type of work that you do ask if it's okay for you to share aspects of your work, because it can feel very, very difficult and unbalanced of friendships and relationships when one person can share about their day-to-day experiences, but the other person is holding in. Oftentimes, our friends and families don't mind. They just don't know how to ask or if it's okay for them to open up that door. So go ahead and take the initiative and say, hey, I know that I shared with you that I am in the sex industry. Would it be okay if from time to time I called you and talked to you about some of the things that I'm experiencing? I guarantee you people are open to hearing just how your day-to-day functions are very similar to some of the things that they deal with in their workspace. Create your own safe space, reaching out to other sex workers to develop a sense of community. Finding peer-to-peer relationships are incredibly important, especially because there are definitely some nuances to working in the sex industry that having another sex worker to bounce off ideas and supportive resources can be very, very vital to sustaining your mental health and your emotional health in the sex industry. Try considering the thought of coming out and sharing your narrative on your own terms. There's nothing like the fear of being outed, right? So if you can have an opportunity to determine, this is what I want to share about my life and my lifestyle, and this is who I want to share it with, and this is how I want them to learn about it, instead of the fear of them coming across your work or someone using your work against you. Again, coming out and telling your own narrative based on your terms versus being outed. Begin taking pride in your work. Spend some time journaling. What's good about it? How does your work help other people? Who does it benefit? Sometimes we carry society's shame and stigma as well as other people, which makes it really difficult to have kind of this value argument going on in your mind as you're trying to produce content and engage with others. Think about the kind of clients that you work with. Many of your clients have engage in the community openly. They are day-to-day people that you interact with. So making sure that you are aware of the type of clientele that you serve and their very civilian lifestyle. More people interact with sex workers on a day-to-day basis than will admit. However, if we take a moment and think about our audience and think about our clients, quite frankly, it puts us right in the mix of the typical normal, don't like using those type of words, but the general population. Shush the comments. I think it's incredibly important as sex workers who are constantly getting feedback, both negative feedback, critical feedback, shame, a lot of people doing projection of their own feelings and insecurities around sex and sexuality onto us. Hearing and reading those comments on a day-to-day basis can be very, very daunting. It can be anxiety producing. It can increase depression, along with several other negative emotions. So maybe you need to ask someone to review your comments and delete the negative ones. Maybe you need to stay out of the comments except for, once every couple of weeks or something along those lines. Block negativity when and whenever possible. Also be aware of how much you're isolating. When's the last time you went outside? When's the last time you hung out with friends or done an activity that didn't involve the computer screen? Make sure you're getting up and getting out and engaging in your community the best way that you can. Remember, the work that we do and the stigma that's attached to it can be incredibly isolating. isolating yourself can certainly lead to a surge and exacerbation of mental health issues and just all around negative emotions, and physically being kept up in the house or kept up in your workspace or studio can take a toll on you. So make sure you're doing regular check-ins, schedule time to be out and about, or just doing activities outside of work that allow you to engage with others or in other spaces. Finally, I would like to make some recommendations for those within our community that we know engage in sex work, but from the other end, our consumers, our audience, our clientele. Here we go. Try your very best to support policies that help break the stereotypes around sex workers. Okay, so stigma is very much embedded into social policy, and it perpetuates stereotypes. It perpetuates policing of one's body, one's choices over their body. It criminalizes sex work. It criminalizes sex workers for taking autonomy of their body. So things that you can do: support public policy that considers the safety, autonomy, and normalization of sex work, and demand that sex workers are a part of influencing policy. Try your very best to normalize interactions with sex workers. That may sound a little bit like this. I was talking to one of my favorite porn stars the other day, and she really recommended that I should try communicating more openly with my partner. We talk about sex and relationships quite often, and we get a lot of information from our leaders in the sex industry. However, we never see a large number of our audience quoting where that information came from or citing where that information came from. So just letting it roll off your tongue. I saw my favorite sex worker do X, Y, and Z on cam last night, and I totally thought that's hot and I want to try it. The more we normalize the fact that we engage with sex workers day to day, we make it a safe environment for sex workers, and we allow other people to address potentially their shame. So this definitely will take some work from both sex workers to work on working through issues related to stigma, and those that are consumers, clients, and our audience, in helping to create a narrative that is normal for people to engage with sex workers. If we don't share, we can't normalize it, and people get the idea that they don't know sex workers, and quite frankly, you know us very well. I'd also like to ask that when there's an opportunity, include our job titles, our pay rates in public places, public reports, those figures that we pay taxes, that we are a viable part of our communities, quite frankly. And this can be done when, you have an opportunity to, in your reports, your findings, your presentations, to include sex work as a viable option for work. Stigma lies in shame, and shame happens in darkness. So shed light on sex work by bringing it up as a real, viable livelihood, because it is. Many of us are in this industry in for the long haul and are sustaining ourselves and our families in great ways. Be super careful with the verbiage. Just like I said a couple of times throughout, we don't like to use the word normal people or normal regular people versus non-regular people. Sex workers are definitely people, and many of us are quite normal. So it's super important that we don't use words like that. Let's try to say things like the general population or civilians or non-sex workers. So those are a couple of tips that will help alleviate some of the stressors associated with being in the sex industry. A lot of those stressors specifically come from the stigma that's associated with being a sex worker. Take care of your mental health. Take care of your physical health. Try your very best to create support systems inside the sex industry and outside the sex industry whenever possible. Consider sharing your own narrative on your terms. Diversify your space in this industry. It's huge. Beyond being in front of the camera, there's lots of ways to diversify your longevity in the industry behind the camera. And for those of you that enjoy sex work, that have used it as a way of entertainment and education, we ask that you get behind us in this movement of normalizing sex work and sex workers. You do know a sex worker, so please do your very best to support us and reduce stigma whenever possible. Strongly encourage you to check out Pineapple Support and Blue Pearl Therapy for your mental health needs. We are definitely sex worker friendly. Thank you so much for listening. I am Jasmine Johnson, your licensed clinical therapist from Blue Pearl Therapy, and of course, Jet Setting Jasmine on all platforms where you can see how I openly engage in sex work. Thanks so much.